The scent of polished leather and fresh espresso filled the air of the Sterling Elite Auto showroom. Soft jazz music played in the background, blending with the faint hum of whispered conversations and the sharp clicking of expensive designer shoes against the marble floor. The dealership wasn't just a place to buy cars. It was an experience, designed to cater to the wealthiest clientele who sought luxury, exclusivity, and prestige. Jonathan Reese stepped inside, adjusting the sleeves of his plain polo shirt. His jeans were clean, but simple, his sneakers well-worn, but comfortable. He wasn't dressed to impress, and that was exactly the point. With an air of quiet confidence, he walked past the gleaming rows of high-end sports cars, sleek Lamborghinis, Rolls-Royces with deep black paint that reflected the showroom's crystal chandeliers, Bentleys that exuded power and wealth. He trailed his fingers along the smooth hood of a silver Aston Martin, taking his time. But the moment he stepped in, he noticed something. No one acknowledged him. Not a single sales associate looked in his direction. They saw him. He could feel their eyes flicker toward him. But they chose to ignore him. Less than 15 feet away, a man in an expensive navy suit stepped inside with his wife, her diamond bracelet flashing under the lights. Instantly, a young salesman rushed forward with a beaming smile. "Welcome to Sterling Elite Auto. What brings you in today? We've got an exclusive collection in the VIP showroom. Champagne while you browse?" The suited man gave a polite chuckle, nodding along as the salesman led him toward a private section. Jonathan watched carefully. It wasn't just about service. It was about who got the service. 30 seconds passed, a minute, then 2. Not a single employee approached him. A receptionist sat behind a sleek black desk, her nails perfectly manicured as she tapped away at her keyboard. Jonathan approached with a calm, polite smile. "Excuse me," he said. "I'd like to—" "Sales reps are busy," she interrupted without looking up. "If you're just looking, you can wait outside." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Outside? Outside?" he echoed. The receptionist let out a sigh, finally glancing up. Her expression barely hid her impatience. "Yes, sir. We try to keep the showroom clear for serious buyers." Jonathan tilted his head slightly. So that's how it was. Before he could respond, another salesman approached. Ron, middle-aged, salt and pepper hair, sharp suit. But his smile was anything but welcoming. "Sir, this dealership caters to a very specific clientele," Ron said smoothly, eyes dropping to Jonathan's sneakers before meeting his gaze again. Jonathan held his stare. "Is that right?" Ron's smile didn't falter. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at our pre-owned lot. We have excellent financing options, if that's a concern." Jonathan let the words settle, feeling the weight of them. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This wasn't about being too busy or not having time for customers. This was deliberate. They had already decided he didn't belong here. Just a few feet away, the man in the navy suit was now sitting inside a Bentley, the salesman practically fawning over him, laughing at his jokes, complimenting his choice. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Jonathan exhaled slowly. He had seen this before, too many times. He gave Ron a small nod, as if considering his words. "You might be right," he murmured. Then slipping his hand into his pocket, he pulled out his phone. The employees thought they had dismissed him. They thought they had sent him away. But they had no idea who they had just humiliated. Jonathan remained still for a moment, his grip tightening around his phone. The weight of the receptionist's words settled in his chest, not because he hadn't heard them before, but because they were so predictable. He could walk into a place like this, a place he owned, and still he'd be treated like an outsider. Still, Jonathan didn't react. He wasn't here to start a scene. He was here to see how they treated people when they thought no one important was watching. He turned his gaze back to the showroom. A car had caught his eye, a sleek, jet-black Rolls-Royce Phantom, parked under the crystal lighting like a throne waiting for a king. Its price tag was high enough to buy a house. But that wasn't the point. He stepped toward it, running a hand over the polished hood. Behind him, the receptionist sighed loudly. "Sir, like I said, if you're just looking—" "I'm not just looking," Jonathan interrupted smoothly. I want to speak to a sales rep. The receptionist barely concealed her irritation. Fine. She gestured toward the showroom floor with a lazy wave of her hand. You can wait. Someone will assist you if they have time. Jonathan turned slightly, eyes scanning the showroom. Not a single employee was paying attention to him. Instead, all their energy was focused on another customer. Across the floor, a wealthy white man in a tailored navy suit stepped out of his luxury SUV. Instantly, the energy in the dealership changed. A salesman rushed over, posture straight, flashing a wide, eager smile. Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to Sterling Elite Auto. What brings you in today? We just got an exclusive shipment in the VIP showroom. Let me show you. Jonathan's fingers tapped lightly against the hood of the Rolls-Royce. It wasn't the service itself that irritated him. It was the contrast. He had been standing here for almost 10 minutes. Not one greeting. Not one offer for assistance. Yet the moment this white customer walked in, 3 salesmen practically tripped over themselves to serve him. Jonathan exhaled through his nose. All right, he'd seen enough. Still, he wasn't done yet. He wanted to test them. He turned away from the Rolls-Royce and approached a nearby silver Aston Martin DBS. He rested his hand lightly on the door handle, checking out the interior. Then, a sharp voice cut through the air. Sir? Jonathan turned to see Ron, the middle-aged salesman with salt and pepper hair, the one who had ignored him earlier, now suddenly paying attention. But not in a good way. We keep the showroom models pristine for customers who are serious about buying, Ron said, his tone clipped, professional, but not polite. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Serious about buying? Ron's expression didn't shift. Yes, sir. If you're just browsing, we do have a pre-owned section down the road. Jonathan let the words hang between them. Ron wasn't suggesting, he was dismissing. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. That's so? Ron nodded. I think you'll find the financing options there more accessible. Jonathan let out a quiet chuckle. He knew exactly what Ron was saying. This place wasn't for people like him. Before Jonathan could respond, laughter erupted from a group of junior salesmen near the reception desk. They weren't even trying to be subtle about it. One of them, a fresh-faced young man in his 20s, whispered something to his coworker, grinning. You can always tell who's serious and who's just killing time, he muttered. Not so quietly. Jonathan turned slightly, meeting the young man's gaze for a brief second. The kid froze. His smirk faltered. But Ron didn't flinch. The senior salesman still wore that same thin, professional smile, as if he truly believed he was doing Jonathan a favor by sending him somewhere more accessible. Jonathan stayed silent for a beat, taking a slow, measured breath. Then, as if suddenly coming to a decision, he reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against his phone. For the first time since he entered the dealership, his expression shifted. Not anger, not frustration, something colder. Ron had no idea what was about to happen. Neither did the receptionist. Neither did the group of laughing employees. They had made their judgment. They had decided Jonathan Reese was no one worth their time. And that was about to cost them everything. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. He let Ron's words settle, then gave a small, almost indifferent nod. Oh, you might be right, he murmured, turning away. Ron, satisfied, adjusted his tie and walked off, already forgetting the conversation. To him, Jonathan was just another window shopper who didn't belong. Jonathan took slow, measured steps toward the exit, his sneakers barely making a sound against the marble floor. The laughter behind him was unmistakable. Low chuckles from the younger salesman, whispers exchanged between them. Man really thought he was buying a Rolls-Royce, one of them muttered under his breath. Jonathan heard it all. He didn't react, not yet. As he reached the glass doors, he slid his phone from his pocket and pressed a contact without looking. It rang twice. A deep voice answered on the other end. Jonathan didn't waste words. I need you here. Now. He ended the call just as he stepped into the warm afternoon air. The dealership's entrance was lined with luxury vehicles, Ferraris, McLarens, high-end SUVs, all glinting under the sunlight. A valet stood nearby, adjusting his jacket as he waited for the next high-profile guest to arrive. Jonathan stood near the curb, phone still in his grip, his gaze calm but sharp. Inside, through the large showroom windows, he could see the sales team still ignoring him, as if he had never been there at all. Instead, their attention was glued to the suited man and his wife, the ones who had arrived just after Jonathan. One of the salesmen gestured toward the VIP section, speaking animatedly. "This model? Limited production. Only 20 available in the country." Another leaned in, offering a freshly poured glass of champagne. "Would you like to test drive it? We can have it ready in minutes, sir." The man chuckled, clearly enjoying the attention. "Well, I do like exclusivity," he said, running a hand over the Bentley's leather interior. The staff practically tripped over themselves to make him feel valued. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. The contrast couldn't be more obvious. A few minutes ago, he had stood at that same reception desk, ignored, dismissed, and told to leave. And now, the same employees were rolling out the red carpet for someone they assumed belonged. Jonathan flexed his fingers, his patience steady but thinning. He had given them their chance, and they had failed the test. A few feet away, the receptionist leaned toward Ron, whispering something under her breath. Ron glanced toward the doors, spotting Jonathan still standing outside. His lips curled in mild irritation. "Still here?" he muttered. The younger salesman, the same one who had mocked Jonathan earlier, snorted. "Maybe he's looking for bus fare." A ripple of laughter followed. Jonathan remained motionless, composed, waiting. Then it happened. A low, deep rumble of an approaching engine. Not just any engine, the kind that demanded attention. Inside the showroom, the laughter faded. The staff's conversation died mid-sentence as heads instinctively turned toward the entrance. A sleek, black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided smoothly into the driveway, its polished body reflecting the sunlight like a mirror. The car rolled to a perfect stop, its spirit of ecstasy hood ornament gleaming under the sky. The valet straightened immediately, his posture rigid as he hurried toward the vehicle, already reaching for the door handle. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. The same employees who had dismissed Jonathan now found themselves watching, curious, intrigued. VIP clients arrived all the time, but this was different. Inside, Ron frowned, his forehead creasing slightly. He hadn't been expecting a high-profile arrival. The receptionist glanced at him. "Who is that?" she whispered. Ron shook his head, confused. "No idea." Outside, Jonathan didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched. Because he already knew. The real show was just about to begin. The air outside the dealership had shifted. The moment the sleek, black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up, the same employees who had just ignored and humiliated Jonathan were now watching with curiosity, even awe. The valet quickly approached, adjusting his tie, but before he could reach for the door, it swung open from the inside. A tall man stepped out. David Langford, regional manager of Sterling Elite Auto. His navy blue suit was crisp, his gold cufflinks gleaming under the afternoon sun. Everything about him commanded attention. He didn't hesitate, didn't glance around. His eyes locked straight onto Jonathan. Inside the showroom, the staff stiffened. Jonathan remained where he was, calm as ever, his posture relaxed but unwavering. David approached with a firm stride, his polished shoes tapping against the pavement. Then, in front of everyone, he extended his hand. "Apologies for the delay, Mr. Reese." Silence. The moment those words left his mouth, the energy in the dealership shifted violently. Inside, Ron, who had just been laughing at Jonathan minutes ago, froze. The receptionist's fingers halted mid-typing, her perfectly manicured nails hovering uselessly above the keyboard. Her breath hitched. The younger salesman, the one who had muttered about who's serious and who's just killing time, visibly tensed. Jonathan shook David's hand firmly, his expression unreadable. But inside, the employees were scrambling to process what was happening. Mr. Reese? The name echoed in their heads. It couldn't be. Not that Reese. Not the Jonathan Reese. Ron's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his body suddenly rigid. David turned, glancing at the stunned employee standing inside. His gaze was sharp, assessing. He had already noticed the tension in the air. Jonathan followed his line of sight, his eyes sweeping over the now silent, frozen sales staff. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, controlled, deadly quiet. "So tell me," he said, letting his words sink in, "is this how we treat people here, Worm?" The weight of that sentence was like a hammer. The staff visibly shrank. Ron opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked toward David, desperate, searching for some kind of escape. The receptionist turned pale. The same woman who had told him to wait outside just minutes ago now looked like she wanted to disappear. Jonathan slowly stepped forward, his hands in his pockets, his voice still frighteningly even. "I walked into this dealership today," he continued, "and not a single one of you thought I was worth your time." No one spoke. No one even breathed. "You looked at my clothes," he said, gesturing at his simple polo and jeans, "and you decided I wasn't important, that I didn't belong." His gaze landed on Ron. "You told me to go to the pre-owned lot," he said, his tone razor sharp. "Said you had better financing options." Ron's jaw clenched. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. Jonathan let that hang in the air before glancing back at the showroom, where the well-dressed white customer was still sipping champagne, still being treated like royalty. "And yet," Jonathan continued, "when someone else walked in, someone who looked the part, you bent over backwards for them. The employees looked like they had just been caught in a storm with no shelter." David crossed his arms, his expression cold. "Is this really how you're running my dealership?" he asked, his voice sharp. More silence. Ron finally found his voice. "Mr. Reese, sir, this was a misunderstanding," he stammered. We didn't realize." Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "You didn't realize," he repeated. Ron nodded quickly. "We had no idea you were—" Jonathan held up a hand, cutting him off. "That's the problem," he said quietly. Ron's breath hitched. "You only respect people," Jonathan continued, his voice dangerously calm, "when you know they have power." The truth of that statement crushed whatever hope Ron had of escaping this. The receptionist blinked rapidly, her hands trembling slightly. The younger salesman, the one who had whispered, "Who's serious and who's not," looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Jonathan turned to David. "Call everyone in," he said simply. David nodded once. "Right away, sir." He pulled out his phone and made a call. Inside the showroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. The same employees who had laughed at Jonathan, whispered behind his back, now stood frozen in fear. Because now they knew. They hadn't just insulted a random customer. They had humiliated the owner. And they were about to learn exactly what that mistake would cost them. The air inside the dealership had become thick with tension. The once confident showroom staff, who had laughed, whispered, and dismissed Jonathan just minutes ago, now stood rigid, their eyes darting toward one another, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Ron, the senior salesman, who had told Jonathan to check out the pre-owned lot, swallowed hard. His sharp confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by something raw and uncomfortable. Fear. The receptionist, who had barely spared Jonathan a glance earlier, now looked like she was holding her breath, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. The younger salesman, the same one who had mocked Jonathan under his breath, had his shoulders hunched, avoiding eye contact. Jonathan stood at the center of it all, his posture calm but unyielding. His voice when he spoke was low even, but sharp as a blade. "Is this how we treat people?" Ron flinched at the question. It was direct, unavoidable. "Sir, Ron started, forcing a shaky laugh. "Mr. Reese, this is all just a misunderstanding." Jonathan's eyes didn't move from his face. A misunderstanding? Ron nodded quickly, desperate. Of course. We had no idea who you were. Otherwise, Jonathan tilted his head slightly. Otherwise, Ron's mouth opened, then closed. He realized too late that he had just stepped into a trap. Jonathan let the silence stretch before speaking again. So if I had been someone else, just another black man walking in off the street, this would have been okay? The words hit like a hammer. Ron visibly stiffened. The younger salesman near the reception desk lowered his gaze, suddenly fascinated by his shoes. The receptionist's lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. No one answered. Because there was no excuse. Jonathan let out a slow breath, his fingers loosening and tightening at his sides. He had seen plenty of things in his lifetime. But this was what disgusted him the most. The fact that people like Ron, like all of them, only showed respect when they thought it was required, when they thought power was in the room. Jonathan took a slow step forward, and no one moved. The employees who had once been so arrogant stood frozen in place. Even the suited customer, the one who had been sipping champagne while Jonathan had been ignored, was now watching silently, his curiosity turning into unease. Jonathan's voice, when he spoke again, was deadly quiet. You made a choice today, he said. Ron swallowed thickly. Sir, we just... Jonathan ignored him. His eyes swept over the entire staff. Every single one of you, he continued, decided who mattered and who didn't, who deserved respect and who didn't. And you did it without even thinking. The silence in the showroom was suffocating. Jonathan let his gaze settle back on Ron. You looked me in the eye and told me to go somewhere more accessible. His voice never wavered. So tell me, Ron, what does that mean? Ron's throat bobbed. Sir, Jonathan cut him off with a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. You assumed I couldn't afford to be here. His words were sharp, cutting through the air like glass. You assumed I wasn't worth your time, and you treated me like I didn't belong. Ron was shaking his head rapidly now. It wasn't like that, sir. I was just trying to keep the showroom clear for serious buyers. Jonathan gave a small nod. Serious buyers. Another beat of silence. Then, Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The employees stiffened. David Langford, the regional manager, watched in silence, his arms crossed. He wasn't going to interfere. This was Jonathan's moment. Jonathan scrolled through his contacts, his expression unreadable. Then, he pressed a number and lifted the phone to his ear. The employees watched in tense silence as he spoke. Yeah, Jonathan said simply. I need you here. He didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The weight of what was coming settled over the showroom like a storm cloud. Ron was breathing faster now, panic flickering behind his eyes. The receptionist's hands were trembling as she tried to straighten the paperwork on her desk. The younger salesman, who had whispered about who was serious, looked ready to pass out. Jonathan let the silence linger. Then, with a voice that was softer now, but still razor sharp, he said, You don't have a customer problem, Ron. He let that sink in before adding, You have a leadership problem. Ron's face drained of color, because he knew what that meant. And the worst part? There was nothing he could do about it. The call had been made. The reckoning was about to begin. A thick, suffocating silence gripped the showroom floor. No one spoke. No one moved. The air, once filled with arrogance and laughter, was now heavy with something else. Fear. Jonathan Reese stood at the center of it all, his presence no longer ignored, no longer dismissed. He had their full attention now. The front doors swung open with a quiet hiss, and in walked three men in tailored suits, their expressions unreadable. At the center was David Langford, the regional manager. His sharp gaze swept over the staff before he stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He didn't smile, didn't offer a greeting. Instead, his words were sharp and final. Effective immediately, everyone involved in today's incident is terminated. The words hit like a sledgehammer. The receptionist gasped audibly, her hands flying to her mouth. The younger salesman, the one who had whispered about serious buyers, took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief. But no one reacted worse than Ron. His face went deathly pale, his entire body visibly shaking. Wait, sir. Please, let's talk about this. David's gaze didn't waver. There's nothing to discuss. Ron's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. Mr. Langford, I've been working here for years. You can't just fire me over a misunderstanding? David didn't blink. This isn't a misunderstanding, Ron. This is a reflection of your choices. Ron turned to Jonathan, desperation creeping into his voice. Mr. Reese, please. If I had known who you were, I never would have. Jonathan's eyes darkened. Exactly. Ron froze. That's the problem, Jonathan said, his voice dangerously quiet. You would have treated me differently if you knew I had power. But what about every other person who walked in before me? How many people have you dismissed just because they didn't look the part? Ron opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no answer. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice carrying through the entire showroom. Respect doesn't cost a damn thing. He let the words sink in before continuing. But ignorance. He glanced at Ron, at the receptionist, at the other employees who had laughed behind his back. That'll cost you everything. The room remained dead silent. The receptionist who had told him to wait outside was on the verge of tears. She took a shaky breath, her voice small. Mr. Reese, I wasn't trying to be rude, Jonathan held up a hand, cutting her off. You didn't think I mattered. She flinched at the words. Jonathan scanned the faces of every employee, letting the weight of the moment settle. I built this company from the ground up, he said, his voice steady. Not for people who only respect money, but for people who respect character. If you don't understand that, you don't belong here. Ron's hands balled into fists at his sides. Please, sir, I need this job. Jonathan held his gaze for a long moment. Then quietly he said, You should have thought about that before you judged me. Ron's shoulders sagged. He looked completely broken. David cleared his throat, his voice final. Collect your things and leave. One by one, the dismissed employees started moving, their faces pale, their movements robotic. Ron stared at Jonathan one last time, his face full of regret, before he turned and walked out the door. The receptionist followed, her heels clicking against the floor in shaky, uneven steps. The younger salesman, the one who had laughed at Jonathan, looked seconds away from fainting. He swallowed hard, nodded mutely, and left. The employees who remained, the ones who had watched it all unfold but had done nothing, stood in silent shock. Then, Jonathan's gaze landed on one employee who hadn't spoken the entire time. A young black worker, no older than 22, stood near the service desk. He wasn't wearing a suit like the others, just a company polo and slacks. He had watched the entire incident unfold, but had never laughed, never participated. Jonathan stepped toward him. Name? The young man straightened immediately. Devin, sir. Jonathan studied him. How long have you been here, Devin? A little over a year, Devin answered. I mostly work in service, not sales. Jonathan nodded slowly. Did you see what happened today? Devin hesitated, then nodded. Yes, sir. Jonathan's gaze didn't waver. And? Devin exhaled, shifting slightly. It wasn't right. Jonathan studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. You still have a job. Devin's shoulders relaxed in quiet relief. Jonathan turned back to David. Make sure he gets moved to a better position. David nodded. Consider it done. Jonathan exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. He glanced around the now half-empty showroom, where only the remaining staff stood, silent, humbled. Then he spoke one final time. This isn't just about selling cars. It's about how you treat people. Remember that, or don't bother coming back tomorrow. The words hung heavy in the air. Jonathan turned, heading toward the exit. The moment he stepped outside, the valet, the only employee who had treated him with respect from the start, stood waiting. "Can I get your car, sir?" the young man asked, his tone professional. Jonathan reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and handed it to him. "You handled yourself well today," Jonathan said. The valet hesitated, then took the bill. "Thank you, sir. He swallowed. "I just try to treat everyone the same." Jonathan smiled faintly. "That's exactly why you'll go far." Behind him through the glass doors, he could still see the stunned faces of the remaining employees. And in that moment, he knew a lesson had been learned. The air outside the dealership was warm, but Jonathan Reese barely noticed. He had walked into his own business today and been treated like a nobody. Now, the people who had judged him had just paid the price. Behind him, through the glass doors of Sterling Elite Auto, the aftermath of the confrontation was still unfolding. Ron was still standing in the middle of the showroom, his face frozen in disbelief. The receptionist, the younger salesman, and the other fired employees stood near the exit, silent, pale, shaken. Jonathan didn't need to watch them anymore. Their lesson had been delivered. His mission was complete. As he stepped toward the curb, the valet, a young man in his early 20s, dressed in a crisp black uniform, stood at attention. His name tag read Marcus. Unlike the others, Marcus hadn't ignored him, hadn't judged him. "Sir," Marcus said, reaching for his earpiece, "I can bring your car around." Jonathan held up a hand. "Already taken care of." Just then, a second black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up, its deep black paint reflecting the golden hue of the setting sun. A personal driver in a navy suit stepped out, walking around to open the door. Jonathan turned back to Marcus, studying him for a moment. "How long have you been working here?" Marcus straightened his posture. "Almost 2 years, sir." Jonathan nodded. "And in those 2 years, how many times have you seen them pull something like this?" Marcus hesitated. He glanced toward the glass doors where the remaining employees stood, their heads down, avoiding eye contact. Then, quietly, he answered, "Too many times." Jonathan exhaled slowly. Exactly what he expected. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crisp $500 bill. "You handled yourself well today," he said, handing it over. Marcus's eyes widened. He took the money but looked hesitant. "Sir, I was just doing my job." Jonathan smiled faintly. "That's exactly why you'll go far." Marcus straightened. "Thank you, Mr. Reese." Jonathan gave him a small nod, then turned toward his car. As he stepped into the back seat, he glanced one last time toward the dealership. Through the glass, Ron stood there, motionless, his face drained of color. The same man who had laughed at Jonathan, dismissed him, and told him to visit the pre-owned lot was now standing there, fired, humiliated, and powerless. The receptionist was still holding her clipboard, her hands visibly trembling. The younger salesman, the one who had whispered about who's serious and who's not, was now standing with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Jonathan let the moment stretch. Then, he spoke his final words. "Respect doesn't cost a thing, but ignorance, that'll cost you everything." He didn't wait for a response. With a quiet exhale, he settled into his seat. The driver closed the door. The Rolls-Royce glided away from the curb, disappearing smoothly into the evening traffic. As the car disappeared down the street, the camera slowly panned back to the dealership, where Ron and the other fired employees stood watching helplessly, still unable to believe what had just happened. Inside, the remaining staff, the ones who had witnessed everything but hadn't participated, stood silent, reflecting on the weight of the moment. They would never forget who had just walked through their doors today, and they would never make the same mistake again. Have you ever faced discrimination like this? Share your story in the comments below. If you believe respect should be for everyone, hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful stories.